The first thing I saw was a pair of headlights swerving violently through the rain before the car slammed straight into the ditch outside my house. The sound shook my little trailer so hard. I thought lightning had struck the roof. My 7-year-old son Mason jumped awake on the couch beside me, terrified, while thunder cracked so loudly it rattled the windows. I remember pulling back the curtain and seeing this sleek black luxury SUV half buried in mud on the side of the road. Steam pouring from the hood while rain hammered down like bullets from the sky, and standing beside it, soaked from head to toe, was a pregnant woman screaming for help. I had no idea that woman was one of the richest people in the country. I had no idea she owned the company whose buildings I used to help construct before I lost everything. And I definitely had no idea that by the next morning, my entire life would be unrecognizable. But before I tell you what happened, I want you to answer something honestly. If you were broke, struggling to feed your child, barely surviving yourself, and the person standing at your door belonged to the world that destroyed your future, would you still help them? Because that's exactly what happened to me. 3 years ago my life looked completely different. I wasn't rich, but I had stability. I worked construction for a development company in Chicago, pulling 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Hard work never scared me. I grew up poor, and my dad always used to say that a man's value came from how much weight he could carry without complaining. So I carried everything: bills, overtime, responsibility, stress. I carried it all because I had a wife and a newborn son depending on me. Then one winter morning, my wife Emily died on her way to work. Black ice, one drunk driver, one phone call that shattered my entire world. I still remember standing in that hospital hallway holding Mason in my arms while he cried because he was hungry, and I couldn't even process what the doctor was saying to me. It felt like someone had ripped the floor out from under my life. For months afterward I operated like a machine. Wake up, feed Mason, go to work, come home exhausted, repeat. But grief changes people. It changes your sleep, your patience, your spirit. I started making mistakes at work because I wasn't sleeping more than 2 hours a night. One day I dropped a steel beam measurement by a few inches and nearly caused an accident. Nobody got hurt, thank God. But 2 weeks later they let me go anyway. Liability concerns, they called it. After that, everything collapsed fast. Medical bills from Emily's accident piled up. Rent got behind. I sold my truck first, then most of our furniture. I moved Mason and myself into a tiny trailer outside a small town almost 2 hours away because it was the only thing I could afford. I picked up whatever work I could find: roofing, repairs, landscaping, anything. Some weeks I barely made enough money to keep the lights on. The hardest part wasn't being poor. The hardest part was watching Mason notice it. Kids see more than adults think they do. He noticed when I skipped dinner pretending I wasn't hungry. He noticed when I taped his sneakers together because I couldn't buy new ones yet. He noticed when the power got shut off for 6 hours one winter evening and I told him we were camping indoors, while we sat wrapped in blankets. But somehow, through all of it, that little boy still smiled at me every morning like I was a superhero. That's the part that hurt the most, because I didn't feel like one. The storm happened on a Thursday night in October. Rain had been pounding the town since late afternoon, and the wind was so bad branches were snapping across the highway. Mason and I were sitting on the couch eating canned soup while I helped him with spelling homework by flashlight because the electricity kept flickering. Then we heard the crash. At first, I almost ignored it. Out where we lived, people drove drunk on those back roads all the time. But when I looked outside and saw someone waving desperately in the rain, I grabbed my coat immediately. "Stay inside," I told Mason. "I'm coming too," he said. "No, buddy." But by the time I stepped outside, he was already behind me holding an umbrella twice his size. The woman standing near the SUV looked terrified. She couldn't have been older than 35. Dark hair plastered to her face. Expensive clothes ruined with mud. One hand pressed against her pregnant stomach while the other tried desperately to flag me down. "Please," she shouted over the storm. "My phone died and the car won't start." I ran closer. "I don't think so, but I'm 8 months pregnant." The moment she said that, adrenaline kicked in. I helped her walk carefully through the mud toward my trailer while Mason held the umbrella over her like some tiny gentleman. She kept apologizing for being a burden, but she looked pale and exhausted. The second we got inside, Mason grabbed towels without even being asked. That's how Emily raised him. The woman looked around the trailer awkwardly, probably realizing instantly how poor we were. The place was tiny, old furniture, leaky ceiling bucket in the corner, half the cabinets crooked. I suddenly felt embarrassed about everything, but she didn't say a word about it. Instead, she looked at Mason and smiled weakly. "Thank you," she whispered. I made her tea while she sat on the couch trying to warm up. Her hands were trembling so badly, she almost dropped the cup. "My name's Daniel," I said. "Claire. Mason," my son added proudly. She smiled at him again, and I noticed something strange. Despite looking exhausted, she had this calm confidence about her. The kind wealthy people have without even realizing it. I asked if there was anyone I could call for her. "My assistant is probably panicking right now," she admitted. "But I don't remember any phone numbers." Mason suddenly piped up. "You can stay here until the storm stops." I almost apologized for him, but Claire laughed softly. "That's very kind." Then she looked at me carefully. "You really don't recognize me, do you?" I frowned. "Should I?" For a second, she seemed relieved. "No," she said quietly. "That's probably a good thing." Around midnight, the storm got even worse. Roads flooded, trees down everywhere. No tow trucks were coming until morning. Claire tried insisting she could sleep in her SUV. But there was no way I was letting a pregnant woman sit outside in that weather. So I gave her my bed. Mason and I slept on the couch. At least, we tried to. Around 2 in the morning, I heard crying from the bedroom. At first I thought she was in pain. But when I knocked gently and asked if she was okay, she wiped her face quickly and said, "I'm sorry." Pregnancy hormones. But it wasn't hormones, I could tell. There was a heaviness in her voice I recognized immediately because I carried it myself after Emily died. Pain's pain. I sat on the edge of the doorway awkwardly. "You don't have to tell me anything. But sometimes talking helps." For a long moment she stared at the floor, then she finally said, "Everyone thinks money protects you from loneliness. It doesn't." I didn't know what to say to that. So she kept talking. She told me she'd spent the last 5 years building one of the fastest growing real estate companies in the country after inheriting it from her father. She told me investors treated her like a machine instead of a person. She told me the baby's father left the moment he learned she was pregnant because he cared more about public image than family. And then she laughed bitterly. "You know what the worst part is? I have 3 houses and none of them feel like home." That line hit me harder than I expected, because there I was, sitting inside a rundown trailer, with peeling paint and leaking pipes, and somehow it still felt warmer than all the luxury she described. Maybe because love lived there once. Maybe because Mason still filled it with life. We talked for hours that night. About grief, about pressure, about losing people. She asked about Emily, and I found myself telling this stranger things I hadn't told anyone in years. At one point she looked around the trailer again and asked carefully, "How are you managing all this alone?" I shrugged. "Some days better than others." Then Mason wandered sleepily into the room, rubbing his eyes, and climbed into my lap without saying a word. Claire watched us quietly. And something changed in her expression right then, something emotional. The next morning, the storm finally cleared. Sunlight broke through the clouds while I made pancakes from the last bit of mix we had left. Claire came out wearing one of Emily's old sweaters I'd lent her, and for a second the sight nearly broke me because it reminded me of another life. Mason was laughing while trying to flip pancakes badly, and Claire laughed so hard she nearly cried again. It felt weirdly normal. Too normal. Then everything changed the moment 3 black SUVs pulled up outside my trailer. Men in suits stepped out first. Then a woman holding a tablet practically sprinted toward the door looking panicked. "Ms. Beaumont." She gasped the second Claire opened it. And that was the moment I finally realized who she was. Claire Beaumont, CEO of Beaumont Development Group Billionaire. One of the most powerful women in the country, the same company name stamped across the hard hats at the construction site where I lost my job. I just stood there stunned. Her assistant kept talking rapidly about news coverage and security teams searching all night while 2 bodyguards scanned my trailer like they expected danger. Then the assistant looked at me suspiciously. "Who is this?" Before I could answer, Claire said firmly, "The man who helped me when nobody else could." The assistant immediately relaxed, but I didn't because suddenly I remembered every eviction notice connected to failed Beaumont housing projects. Every worker laid off during corporate restructuring. Every promise executives made while ordinary people suffered, and Claire noticed the change in my face immediately. "You know who I am now," she said quietly. I nodded slowly. She looked almost nervous. "Daniel," I interrupted her. "Your company bought the construction firm I worked for." Her expression fell instantly. I continued before I could stop myself. 300 workers got laid off after the merger. Benefits disappeared. Safety corners got cut. I lost everything after that. The room went silent. Even the assistants stopped moving. Claire looked genuinely shaken. I didn't know. I laughed bitterly. "Yeah, Funny how people at the top never know what happens underneath them. Mason looked confused, sensing tension, and honestly, I hated myself in that moment because part of me wanted to be angry at her. Maybe she deserved it. Maybe she represented everything unfair about the world. But another part of me remembered the woman crying alone in the bedroom hours earlier. Not the billionaire. Just the human being. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause for a second and think honestly about what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have lashed out at her? Would you have demanded money? Would you have thrown her out the second you learned who she was? Comment below what you honestly think, because I still wonder sometimes whether I handled it the right way. Claire asked her assistants to wait outside. Then she sat across from me at my tiny kitchen table while Mason colored quietly nearby. "I'm sorry," she said softly. I shook my head. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do." "No, you don't even know me." "But I should know people like you," she replied. "That's the problem." I remember staring at her because those weren't the words I expected from someone like her. Most rich people I'd met talked like poor folks were statistics, but she looked genuinely devastated. Then she asked something I'll never forget. "Can you tell me exactly what happened after the layoffs?" And I did. I told her everything, about losing my insurance after Emily died, about choosing between groceries and electricity, about Mason asking me once why other kids got birthday parties at restaurants while he got cupcakes at home, about lying awake terrified I'd fail my son. Claire listened silently the entire time. No interruptions, no defensiveness, just listening. By the end, she was crying. And suddenly I realized something important. This woman might have had billions, but nobody around her probably ever spoke honestly to her anymore. Everybody either feared her or wanted something from her. For one strange night, I had treated her like a normal person because I didn't know who she was, and maybe that mattered more than either of us realized. Before leaving, she asked for my number. I almost laughed because my phone service had been disconnected 2 days earlier. So she wrote her personal number on a napkin instead. Then she crouched carefully beside Mason. "Thank you for sharing your home with me," she told him. Mason smiled. "Your baby can visit us someday." That nearly broke her emotionally right there. After the SUVs drove away, I honestly assumed I'd never hear from her again. People like Claire Beaumont lived in another universe. But 3 days later, I got a knock at my trailer door. A man in a suit handed me an envelope. Inside was a check. $50,000. I nearly dropped it. There was also a handwritten note. "This isn't charity. It's accountability, Claire." I just stared at it for 10 straight minutes. $50,000. To some people, maybe that's not life-changing money. To me, it felt like oxygen after drowning. I paid every overdue bill first, every single one. Then I bought Mason new clothes, proper groceries, and finally fixed the heater before winter came. For the first time in years, I slept through an entire night without panic crushing my chest. But that wasn't the end of it. 2 weeks later, Claire called me personally. She asked if I'd be willing to come to Chicago for a meeting. I almost said no immediately. I didn't belong in corporate offices anymore. I barely owned decent shoes, but she insisted. When I arrived at Beaumont headquarters, I felt completely out of place. Marble floors, giant glass walls, people in expensive suits rushing everywhere. Then Claire walked into the conference room visibly pregnant and wearing no makeup for once, and she smiled at me like I was an old friend. What happened next stunned me. She introduced me to her executive board. Then she said, "This is Daniel Carter. He's here because I want every person in this room to understand what our decisions look like after they leave spreadsheets." You could hear a pin drop. For the next hour, she made me tell my story to millionaires, real estate executives, investors, corporate lawyers. I was terrified at first, but eventually anger took over. I told them exactly how ordinary workers suffered while executives celebrated quarterly profits. I told them what desperation felt like. Some looked uncomfortable, some looked annoyed. But Claire never took her eyes off them once. Then she announced massive changes to company policy, worker protections, expanded severance packages, emergency family assistance programs. And most shocking of all, she reopened investigations into unsafe restructuring practices connected to the merger that destroyed my job. One executive actually protested. Claire fired him on the spot. Right there in front of everyone. I swear half the room stopped breathing. After the meeting ended, I asked her why she was really doing all this. She looked out the skyscraper window quietly before answering. "Because I realized something sitting in your trailer," she said. "You had almost nothing, and still gave me kindness without expecting anything back. Meanwhile, I had everything, and somehow forgot how to see people. That hit me hard. Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. We became friends, real friends. She'd call sometimes late at night overwhelmed about the baby or business pressure, and I'd talk her through it. Sometimes she'd ask advice about decisions involving workers because she trusted honesty from me more than polished corporate reports. And weirdly enough, Mason adored her. The first time she visited again, he proudly showed her his school drawings like she was family already. Then her baby came early, a little girl named Sophie, and the night Claire went into labor, she called me before anyone else. Not her assistant, not a board member. I rushed to the hospital with Mason half asleep in the back seat because she sounded terrified when I arrived. She grabbed my hand so tightly I thought she'd break it. "I can't do this alone," she whispered. And for the first time in years I felt truly needed again. Not pitied, needed. Hours later, when Sophie was finally born healthy and crying loudly enough to wake the dead, Claire started sobbing with relief. Then she looked at me holding Mason beside the hospital bed and said something I'll carry forever. "This is the first time in years I haven't felt alone." I won't lie and pretend life magically became perfect after that. It didn't. Healing doesn't work like movies. I still missed Emily every day. Claire still struggled balancing motherhood and business. But somehow we helped each other survive. About 6 months later, Claire offered me a full-time position overseeing community housing projects for Beaumont Development. At first I refused. I thought people would assume I took advantage of her kindness. But she said something important. "Daniel, I'm not hiring you because I owe you. I'm hiring you because you see people before profit. I need more of that around me." So I accepted. For the first time in years, I had stability again. Real stability. Mason finally got his own bedroom. I bought him the bicycle he'd been dreaming about for 2 birthdays straight. I started smiling more without forcing it. And honestly, the biggest surprise of all wasn't the money or job. It was realizing how one single act of kindness during the worst imaginable completely changed multiple lives. Because if I had ignored that crash, if I'd let bitterness win, if I'd judged Claire before knowing her, none of this would have happened. Not the friendship, not the second chance, not the healing either of us desperately needed. A year later, Claire stood beside me at Mason's school fundraiser while Sophie sat asleep in her arms. And I remember watching both kids laughing together under cheap carnival lights. That's when it finally hit me. Family doesn't always arrive the way you expect. Sometimes it crashes into your life during a storm. And sometimes the people you think belong to a completely different world are carrying pain just like you. These days, life still isn't perfect, but it's real. Mason's thriving in school. Sophie practically treats me like an uncle. Claire transformed huge parts of her company and started funding housing programs for struggling single parents across multiple states. She says it started because of one rainy night in a trailer. But honestly, I think it started because 2 broken people finally saw each other clearly. And if there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that kindness matters most when it's hardest to give. Anybody can help someone they admire. The real test is helping someone when bitterness tells you not to. So yeah, maybe I was just a poor single dad living in a leaking trailer, but that night I had something money couldn't buy: humanity. And weirdly enough, that ended up changing a billionaire more than all her wealth ever could. If you made it this far, I really want to know what you think. Would you have done the same thing in my position? Or would you have turned her away after learning who she was? Share your thoughts down in the comments because I read every single one. And if you were on my side, make sure you like this video and subscribe for more emotional stories like this. Your support really helps this channel grow. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you all in the next story.